Sirens cut through the morning silence just as my fishing line hit the water, and in that instant I knew my life was about to change. Red and blue lights reflected across the lake like accusations, neighbors gathered with phones raised, and a furious HOA president marched toward me already convinced I was guilty. They had called the cops because I was fishing, certain I was trespassing on community property. What none of them knew was that I legally owned the entire lake, and their confidence was about to trigger an $8.2 million disaster. I stayed calm while officers approached, hands resting near their belts, eyes already judging. The HOA president recited rules, bylaws, and threats as if repetition could turn assumptions into facts. Around us, people whispered, filmed, and waited for me to be removed. In that moment, I realized how easily authority replaces truth when no one questions it. This didn't start that morning. Years earlier, when I bought my property, the listing mentioned shared lake access. Most buyers would have accepted that. I didn't. Something felt off. I hired surveyors, requested county records, and studied deeds that predated the neighborhood. Buried in old documents was a quiet truth: the lake had been privately deeded decades before the HOA ever existed. I never announced it. I paid taxes, maintained the shoreline, and let neighbors enjoy the water. Peace seemed easier than confrontation. Over time, the HOA treated the lake like a trophy, hosting events, enforcing rules, and promising access they never owned. I watched it happen, knowing one day assumptions would collide with reality. That day arrived with sirens. When the officers asked for my identification, I handed it over without argument. I didn't defend myself or raise my voice. That silence confused everyone. The HOA expected resistance, not restraint. What they didn't understand was that truth doesn't need to rush. Standing there, watching police lights dance across water I owned, I realized silence had allowed a lie to grow powerful. By calling the cops, the HOA forced the truth into the open. What followed would dismantle reputations, erase an HOA, and cost millions. This wasn't about fishing anymore. It was about power, arrogance, and the moment documented truth finally spoke louder than authority, changing everything forever. Every person watching that scene believed the story was already written, because authority sounded confident and calm. Yet confidence without verification is fragile, and calm can hide ignorance. That morning marked the exact second assumptions stopped working. The lake became evidence, silence became strategy, and patience became power. What happened next would expose how expensive certainty becomes when no one checks facts first. For everyone involved, nothing would ever feel simple or unquestioned again after this single moment. The officers approached with professional calm, already assuming this would be routine. One asked for my ID while the other explained that the HOA had reported a trespasser fishing on community property. His voice wasn't hostile, just confident, the kind of confidence that comes from believing the facts are settled. Behind them, neighbors leaned closer, whispering, phones held chest high, ready to record what they expected would be a public correction. I handed over my identification without protest. I didn't explain myself. I didn't argue. That silence unsettled people more than shouting ever could. The HOA president mistook it for fear. She stepped forward, holding printed bylaws like proof, pointing at the water as if ownership could be declared out loud. She explained fines, violations, and past warnings I'd never received. Each sentence made her sound more certain, and certainty is persuasive when no one interrupts it. When the officer returned my ID, I finally spoke. I asked, calmly, if I could show documentation before any decision was made. The pause that followed was brief but important. The officer nodded. That single nod shifted the entire situation. I walked to my truck and retrieved a thick folder, worn from years of careful storage. As soon as it appeared, the HOA president scoffed. She said paperwork didn't matter because everyone knows the lake belongs to the community. That statement hung in the air, recorded by half a dozen phones, and it would later echo in court. The officers stepped aside to review the documents. Deeds, parcel maps, surveyor seals, tax records. Each page was stamped, dated, verified. Minutes passed. The lake stayed still. The crowd grew quiet. One officer made a call to county records to confirm parcel numbers. The HOA president grew louder. She accused me of forging documents, of trying to manipulate the police, of intimidating the board. Another board member arrived and demanded I leave immediately. When I didn't move, he reached toward my fishing rod. That was when the officer stepped between us and told him to back away. The phone call ended. The officer returned with a noticeably different posture. He asked the HOA president for proof of ownership. She had none. She offered tradition, usage, and assumption. None of it mattered. The officer explained, clearly and firmly, that county records showed I was the legal owner of the entire lake. Not partially. Not jointly. Completely. He warned the HOA that continued interference could be considered harassment. Silence replaced certainty. Phones lowered. Neighbors stopped whispering. The power dynamic flipped without drama, simply because facts had entered the conversation. As the officers left, the HOA promised lawyers and consequences, convinced authority could still fix this. They had no idea this was only the beginning. That night, while the neighborhood buzzed with rumors and half-truths, my house was quiet. I spread the documents across my dining table the way I had many times before, not because I doubted them, but because I understood what was coming next. Deeds don't change, but people do when power slips through their fingers. And the HOA had just lost its grip in public. The following morning, the response arrived exactly as expected. A certified letter from the HOA's attorney accused me of unauthorized use of community property and demanded I immediately stop fishing and vacate the lake. The language was aggressive, confident, and completely wrong. They hadn't learned anything from the police encounter. Instead of verifying facts, they doubled down on assumption, mistaking volume for authority. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, a quiet man who specialized in land disputes caused by negligence and ego. He called me less than an hour later. "They're panicking," he said. And panic leads to mistakes. His response letter was short, precise, and devastating. It included certified copies of the deed, parcel descriptions, tax records, and a formal demand that the HOA stop claiming ownership of the lake in any form. Rather than retreat, the HOA escalated again. An emergency meeting notice was sent to all homeowners claiming I was attempting to take away a vital community asset. Fear spread fast. People demanded explanations. The board promised solutions it didn't have. Instead of slowing down, they rushed forward blindly, desperate to reassert control. That desperation led to the worst decision of all. Without confirming ownership or consulting residents, the HOA entered negotiations with a private investor. They offered exclusive lake rights for a luxury expansion project, complete with docks, branding, and restricted access. To secure the deal, they accepted a substantial advance payment and used the lake as a central asset in the agreement. On paper, it looked like leadership. In reality, it was fraud. My attorney discovered the agreement during a routine records search. When he called me, his voice was calm but sharp. "They just sold something they don't own," he said. "And the consequences are going to be massive." The HOA had crossed from ignorance into liability, and the people who signed that contract did so personally. The moment the investor discovered the truth, the situation would explode. Contracts would collapse. Money would be demanded back. Lawsuits would follow. And no amount of bylaws or authority would shield the board members from responsibility. The lake was no longer just a source of conflict. It had become a financial time bomb. And the HOA, still convinced it could control the narrative, had no idea how close it was to triggering an $8.2 million mistake that would erase everything they thought they ruled. The investor didn't learn the truth from gossip or angry emails. They learned it the only way that matters in business, through verification. Before releasing the next round of funding, their legal team requested confirmation of lake ownership, a standard safeguard the HOA never anticipated would be used. When county records were pulled, the illusion collapsed instantly. The lake, highlighted in glossy presentations and luxury renderings, was not owned by the HOA at all. It was owned by me. Within 2 days, unfamiliar vehicles appeared throughout the neighborhood. Not police this time, but attorneys, consultants, and financial analysts. They walked the shoreline quietly, took photographs, reviewed maps, and asked direct questions the HOA could no longer answer without lying. The confident board meetings that once ended with applause now ended in silence and closed doors. That evening, my attorney received a call requesting a private discussion. The investor wasn't furious at me. They were alarmed. Millions had already been committed based on written assurances that turned out to be false. Marketing campaigns were live. Buyers were waiting. Development timelines were collapsing by the hour. My attorney laid out the facts calmly, providing certified records and tax histories. There was no debate. Only disbelief. The next morning, the HOA president came to my door alone. No cameras. No board members. No authority. Her voice was softer, careful, and strained. She spoke about misunderstandings, cooperation, and finding a path forward. She suggested shared access agreements, partnerships, even a buyout at what she called a fair price. I listened respectfully and declined. I reminded her that I never sought conflict, and every escalation had come from the HOA's refusal to check facts. What she didn't understand was that negotiation was no longer an option. The investor had already issued a formal demand letter to the HOA, citing misrepresentation, breach of contract, and financial damages. The number attached to that demand was staggering, $8.2 million. It represented lost capital, penalties, legal fees, and projected revenue. And it was only the starting point. Panic spread quickly. Board members resigned overnight. Emergency emails flooded inboxes. Homeowners demanded explanations. The HOA's insurance provider declined coverage, citing intentional misconduct. Legal counsel demanded payment upfront or withdrew entirely. Accounts were frozen pending investigation. The lake, once treated as a casual community amenity, became the center of every problem. Signs vanished. Events were cancelled. Access rules quietly disappeared. The authority that once felt absolute dissolved almost instantly when confronted with documentation. Throughout it all, I continued fishing. Not as provocation, but as proof. Proof that ownership doesn't require shouting, and that truth doesn't need permission to exist. The HOA tried to control the outcome with pressure and deals, but instead triggered consequences that could not be negotiated away. Their mistake was no longer theoretical. It had contracts, deadlines, and a courtroom waiting. The lawsuits arrived faster than anyone expected. First came the investors filing, a thick document outlining misrepresentation, breach of contract, and reliance damages in meticulous detail. Then individual HOA board members were named personally, not as representatives, but as decision makers who had signed their names without verification. Within days, homeowners followed with a class action, claiming they had purchased properties under the promise of lake access that never legally existed. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't an authority anymore. It was a defendant. I was no longer treated as a troublemaker. I was treated as a primary witness. Attorneys requested copies of every document I owned. Deeds. Surveys. Tax receipts. Emails. I complied fully, because I had nothing to hide. During depositions, I repeated the same facts calmly. I never blocked access. I never claimed the lake publicly. I simply owned it, paid for it, and allowed assumptions to grow because silence felt easier than confrontation. The judge moved quickly. A temporary injunction barred the HOA from advertising, managing, or profiting from the lake in any form. All signage was ordered removed. Security measures were dismantled. A court notice clarified ownership to every resident. In a single ruling, years of assumed power evaporated. The lake was officially recognized as private property, and the HOA was warned that any further interference would result in penalties. Behind the scenes, financial collapse accelerated. HOA bank accounts were frozen pending audit. Vendors demanded overdue payments. Attorneys billed aggressively. Insurance carriers formally denied coverage, citing intentional acts and failure to perform due diligence. Without protection, every dollar of liability pointed directly at the board members who had authorized the investor deal. Settlement talks began, then fell apart almost immediately. The investor demanded full reimbursement plus damages. Homeowners demanded refunds, fee reductions, and compensation for misrepresentation. The HOA had nothing left to negotiate with. Their authority no longer carried weight, and their finances could not support prolonged litigation. One afternoon, I received a carefully worded apology letter from the board's remaining counsel. It acknowledged mistakes and requested my public support to help mitigate losses. My attorney advised silence. Apologies do not reverse contracts, and public sympathy does not erase financial harm. When the final figure became public, it stunned the neighborhood. $8.2 million. Not estimated. Confirmed. Tied directly to the lake and the promises built around it. Property values dipped. For sale signs multiplied. The HOA announced its dissolution under court supervision. The irony was undeniable. If they had never called the cops, none of this would have happened. I would have kept fishing quietly. Instead, their attempt to assert control exposed everything. Authority collapsed, truth stood firm, and the cost of assumption became impossible to ignore. With the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood entered an unfamiliar quiet. No warning emails. No violation notices. No board meetings. For years, residents had lived under constant oversight, and its sudden absence felt unsettling. Some welcomed the freedom immediately. Others felt exposed, unsure who handled disputes or decisions now. Authority had vanished, and with it, the illusion of control many had relied on. A court-appointed administrator stepped in to unwind what remained of the HOA. Dues collection stopped overnight. Contracts were cancelled. Every financial decision made over the past several years was audited line by line. What investigators uncovered shocked even the most skeptical residents. Inflated service contracts. Unauthorized expenses. Payments approved without votes or disclosures. The lake had not been the only misrepresented asset. It was simply the most expensive lie built on assumption. Former board members began distancing themselves from one another. Some claimed they were misled. Others blamed legal counsel. None of it mattered. Signatures do not forget. Responsibility follows ink, not excuses. Retirement funds were liquidated. Properties were sold. The $8.2 million loss stopped being a headline and became a personal reality for the people who once enforced rules with confidence. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Neighbors started talking to each other again. Without an HOA acting as an intermediary, conversations replaced complaints. Disagreements were handled face to face. Compromises replaced citations. The community did not fall apart without authority. It adapted. Slowly, carefully, but honestly. Several residents approached me directly, not with demands, but with apologies. Some admitted they had assumed I was wrong simply because the HOA sounded official. Others said they had been afraid to question anything for fear of fines. I accepted the apologies quietly. This had never been about being right. It had been about truth surfacing when silence no longer protected it. Developers, city representatives, and private organizations reached out to me with offers to buy or lease the lake. The numbers were tempting. Life-changing, even. I considered each proposal seriously. In the end, I declined them all. I placed legal protections on the property to prevent development and limit usage to peaceful recreation by permission only. That decision surprised many people. They expected profit. What they didn't understand was that money had never been the motivation. Control had been forced on me by others, and I refused to repeat the same mistake in reverse. One evening, as the sun lowered and the water turned gold, I stood where the police lights had once flashed. No tension. No crowd. Just quiet. And in that stillness, I understood something clearly. This wasn't a story about victory. It was a story about restraint, responsibility, and what happens when truth is finally allowed to stand without interruption. Months passed, and the neighborhood slowly learned how to function without a central authority telling everyone what to do. At first, people expected chaos. They whispered about property values collapsing, disputes spiraling out of control, and the community falling apart. None of that happened. What replaced the HOA was something quieter and more human, responsibility returning to individuals. Small issues were handled face to face. A loud party ended with a knock on the door, not a violation notice. A parking disagreement became a conversation instead of a fine. People were more careful now, not because they feared punishment, but because they understood consequences. The collapse of the HOA had removed fear, and in doing so, it removed resentment too. The story of the lake continued to travel far beyond the neighborhood. Nearby communities contacted county offices to recheck their own records. Some HOAs quietly paused development plans. Others ordered independent audits of amenities they had always assumed were communal. No one wanted to become the next cautionary tale told in courtrooms and council meetings. I was invited to speak at a local property rights workshop, not as a hero, but as a case study. I declined appearing publicly but allowed my documents to be used anonymously. Facts didn't need a face. They needed visibility. The lesson was simple and uncomfortable: authority does not create ownership, and repetition does not turn assumptions into truth. One afternoon, I received an email from a former HOA board member. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It was reflective. They admitted they had never once questioned the lake's ownership because it had always been spoken of as community property. We inherited the assumption, they wrote, and enforced it without checking. That admission mattered more than any apology. The lake itself remained unchanged by human conflict. Birds returned to the reeds. Fish gathered near the banks. Seasons passed without regard for lawsuits or meetings. Watching that constancy made something clear. Human power is loud but temporary. Truth is quiet and patient. It waits. Sometimes I replay that morning in my mind. The police lights. The phone's recording. The certainty in the HOA president's voice. I don't feel anger anymore. I feel clarity. That moment forced honesty into a system built on convenience. It exposed how easily people surrender judgment when authority sounds confident enough. Now, when I fish, neighbors sometimes join me. They ask permission. I grant it freely. Not because I have to, but because trust rebuilt slowly is stronger than authority imposed suddenly. The lake became a place of understanding rather than entitlement. What happened here didn't just dissolve an HOA. It changed how people thought about power. And that change lingered long after the paperwork was filed, shaping decisions in ways no fine or rule ever could. The true impact of what happened didn't appear in courtrooms or bank statements. It surfaced quietly, in everyday decisions people began making differently. Real estate listings in the area changed their language. Vague phrases like shared amenities disappeared, replaced with verified ownership disclosures. Title companies became cautious. Buyers asked harder questions. The lake had turned into a lesson that spread far beyond its shoreline. Messages started arriving from people I had never met. Some lived in other states. Some were part of HOAs dealing with aggressive boards. Others were homeowners who felt something was wrong but didn't know how to challenge it. They all shared a similar fear. Authority had told them one story, but their instincts told them another. I replied when I could, always with the same advice. Check the records. Stay calm. Document everything. Truth doesn't need urgency. It needs accuracy. One message stood out more than the rest. It came from a retired county clerk who had spent decades filing deeds no one ever read. She thanked me for reminding people that records exist for a reason. Paper doesn't shout, she wrote, but it never forgets. That sentence captured the entire story. The HOA relied on noise and repetition. Truth waited quietly in files until someone finally opened them. The former board members continued dealing with consequences long after headlines faded. Some struggled to find employment once background checks revealed litigation tied to misrepresentation. Others moved away entirely, unable to escape the reputation that followed them. Titles disappeared, but records remained. Responsibility, once ignored, has a way of resurfacing when least convenient. For me, the lake transformed from a private certainty into a public reminder. It was no longer something I kept quiet to avoid conflict, nor something I defended out of pride. It became a symbol of what happens when assumptions are left unchallenged for too long. Every calm morning by the water reinforced that clarity prevents conflict far better than silence ever could. On the anniversary of the incident, I returned to the exact spot where police cars had once parked. The water was still. No cameras. No crowd. No authority demanding answers. That quiet felt different from before. It wasn't fragile. It was earned. It existed because everything was finally honest. I realized then that the real cost of the HOA's mistake wasn't only financial. It was trust. Trust between neighbors. Trust in leadership. Trust in systems people assumed were checked by someone else. Rebuilding that trust took time, but it began with one undeniable fact placed in the open. The lake never cared who learned the lesson. But people did. And many carried it forward into decisions they would make for the rest of their lives, long after the story stopped being told aloud. Only one chapter remained, not to describe conflict, but to explain why it all mattered in the end. When everything finally settled, there was no dramatic finale, no applause, and no sense of victory. The final court order arrived quietly, confirming what had already been proven beyond dispute. I owned the lake. The HOA no longer existed. The $8.2 million loss was officially recorded, not as punishment, but as consequence. It marked the end of an organization built on assumption and the beginning of accountability that could not be argued away. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. There is a difference. Triumph seeks validation. Steadiness comes from knowing the truth held firm when tested. Throughout everything, facts never changed. They didn't react to threats, meetings, or pressure. They waited. And when forced into the open, they spoke clearly without raising their voice. Over time, the neighborhood found a new rhythm. Without an HOA, people communicated directly. Problems were solved through conversation instead of citations. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honesty, I learned, is far more sustainable than authority built on repetition. The lake became part of that balance, no longer a symbol of control, but of clarity. People often ask what the lesson is, expecting something dramatic. A warning. A slogan. The truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. Never confuse confidence with correctness. Never assume someone else has already verified the facts. And never underestimate how expensive a small lie can become when everyone agrees not to question it. If the HOA had asked one question years earlier, none of this would have happened. If they had checked one deed, confirmed one record, or listened instead of threatened, the lake would have remained just water. Instead, they chose authority over accuracy. That choice cost them everything. I still fish there. Same shoreline. Same quiet mornings. But now, each cast carries perspective rather than pride. I understand that peace maintained by silence is temporary. Sometimes, peace requires clarity, even when clarity feels disruptive. Speaking up earlier might have prevented catastrophe. Waiting allowed the lie to grow. This story was never about defeating an HOA. It was about what happens when ordinary people stop assuming power equals truth. It was about how easily systems fail when no one checks the foundation. And it was about the strength of staying calm when everyone expects you to back down. The HOA called the cops expecting compliance. What they triggered instead was exposure. Exposure of a mistake so large it erased authority, rewrote lives, and reshaped an entire community's understanding of power. In the end, the lake never changed. The water stayed calm. The land stayed firm. What changed was awareness. And awareness, once earned, doesn't fade. Because truth doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs one moment to be seen.